the Valerian Isles, jewels of the Ibero Sea. Long a center of naval commerce, the people here have...
At first I was planning to do a buffs and debuffs breakdown as a second video in this miniseries. But while writing the script for that, I noticed that without this topic, some of the stuff there will require clairvoyance on the viewer's part. So time for a quick double feature to fill the blanks and scare some people with math on the screen. Elemental affinities in Tactics Ogre Reborn have a noticeable effect on the gameplay, and are something more than the flavor choice. They have a quite substantial impact on damage during the game, and follow very specific rules. We can divide affinities in two groups. The first one will be the 6 basic elements: wind, earth, lightning, water, fire, and ice. Each of them is strong versus one of the other elements, and weak against another one, following this little chain on the screen. The second group has only 2 elements, light and dark. They are both strong against each other. But what being strong or weak means in this context anyway? On the very basic level, it can be explained as a bonus or penalty to damage of skills. To get you an example, we have a character with wind elemental affinity. If they attack a character with earth elemental affinity, the damage formula of their attack will receive a bonus of 30% in some part of the calculations, since earth is weak to wind. However, if the same character attacks a different target with ice elemental affinity, the damage formula will receive a minus 10% penalty instead, because wind is weak to ice. Light and dark are special in their own right. Both deal and take increased damage to each other, while being neutral to the rest. Things can get complicated later, since not only characters can have an elemental affinity, the same is true for skills and equipment. And yes, those things stack and result in more complex calculations. But as a rule of thumb, you could assume that if elemental affinity of weapon, skill and character are in sync, the damage number will be much higher than in case of mismatch. And if the character of fire affinity uses a weapon or skill with water affinity, the numbers will go down. That's enough for now in regards of elemental affinity topic. I assume you get the basic principle, and more convoluted details will have their own dedicated parts in other videos, if they will be needed. Time for the second part, damage calculations. I mentioned earlier in a vague way that elemental affinity affects part of damage formula, and not the final number directly. So it's time to give you more details. But first, we will need to take a quick look at the character stat screen. For now, we're interested in 2 subsections of them. Physical side, that will consist of strength, dex and wit, and magical side, that's composed from int, mind and res. So, time for math, starting from physical side. The generic damage formula for physical attack looks like this. As you can see, there's already some things to explain. Let's start with the separation of the formula into 2 lines. The part that uses characters' stat values in the equation is called in the internet by the name of stat overhead. And that's the part of the equation that is affected by most of the buffs and debuffs in the game. The second part uses values that are present on equipment that's worn by characters. Weapons and jewelry for the attacker, and armor and jewelry for the target of attack. You can also notice something called class attack and class defense. Those are constants that differ from each unit class and are modified by unit level. You cannot really interact with those, but I'm showing them so you can figure out why the damage is a little bit different than the raw stats would suggest. Another thing we need to talk about is the presence of equip mod in many parts of the formula. As you could deduce, each type of weapon that character can use to attack provides different values for this equation. I will not go into the details here, since that could easily be its own quite long video. Let's just say that some weapons are more effective in the hands of characters with higher strength, and others prefer higher dex. But we need some examples for less abstract numbers. Since the character from the screenshot uses greatsword as their weapon of choice, I'll use that weapon type values. And I'll simplify the formula a little bit to save space on the screen. With that, we also need some attribute values to put into the formula, for both the attacker and the target. And after putting all the numbers, as you can see, the game snapshot matches our calculations. We can easily notice that strength is great stat both in terms of dealing and reducing physical damage. Okay, now time for magical attacks. They work a little bit differently. They also use stats of both attacker and defender in the first part of the equation, but instead of using equipped weapon attack value, each of the spells has its own constant that is put into the formula. The simplified generic template will look something like this. Most of the rules from the physical example apply here as well, but we should look at the part with the spell constant. Elemental compatibility checks the relationship between caster's affinity and affinity of the spell. If they match, like a fire unit using fire spell, we will add 30% multiplier to the spell constant value. If the spell is opposed to the character, for example a fire unit using ice spell, modifier is changed to -50%. Neutral matches do not impact anything here. You can also see a very annoying part of the formula that I named BS. And yes, that stands exactly for what you think it is. Let's just say that's the sum of elemental bonuses and resistance on both target and caster, and a prevailing element on current battle. Yes, this game also cares about that. No, you cannot easily check the values. But thanks to that, my example calculation have a variation of 1 or 2 points of damage when compared to the in-game examples. And it's absolutely infuriating. Nevertheless, as before, let's put some numbers into the equation for an example. I'll use second tier direct spells here, since that's what I have equipped currently on my orc save. In this case, spell modifiers and spell constants look like this. And if we take values of both caster and target, we get formula that looks like this. With that, let's use 3 different elements of spells and compare the results. Here's the screenshot from the spell matching the character affinity. Here's the spell with the opposing affinity. And here's the neutral one. They all target the character that has elemental affinity that's neutral to the caster, to simplify the math. And from this part of my ramblings we can distill 2 main things. 1. Mind is the double dip stat for spellcasters. That's used both in offense and defense. 2. You really want to have an elemental specialist in your spellcaster arsenal. Compounding effects of matching elemental affinities and strength or weaknesses of elements can make or break damage from them, especially in boss fights. I'll end this video on that. I promised myself that the basics will be short, so people are not overloaded with the amount of information delivered at once. There's still some topics I want to cover before starting the deep dive in the actual classes breakdown, so stay tuned. Drop a like, sub to the channel, and if you have some questions, feel free to drop them in the comments below. See ya in the next one.